You don't belong here, old woman. This is a place for warriors, not museum pieces. The words, sharp and venomous, cut through the controlled hum of the Naval War College's Aegis Command Simulator. The crowd of cadets, a sea of crisp, white uniforms and youthful arrogance, rippled with snickers and cruel laughter. Cadet Lieutenant Commander Jackson Price, the speaker, stood with his chest puffed out, a specimen of manufactured confidence, his jaw set in a sneer of casual dominance. He was the golden boy of his class, a third-generation officer whose future seemed as polished and certain as the brass buttons on his uniform. To punctuate his contempt, he took a half-step forward and spat, a deliberate, demeaning act. The glob of saliva landed on the sleeve of the woman's plain, gray maintenance coveralls. The laughter died into a tense, expectant silence. All eyes were on her. The woman, whose name nobody knew, seemed impossibly small in the cavernous, state-of-the-art facility. Her hair, more salt than pepper, was pulled back in a severe, functional bun. Her face was a roadmap of lines etched by time and something deeper, a quiet intensity that seemed to absorb the insult without reaction. She didn't flinch. She didn't gasp. Her gaze, which had been fixed on a secondary diagnostic panel glowing with lines of amber code, did not waver. She simply paused her work, her hands hovering over the console. But in the observation deck above, shielded by polarized glass, Captain Marcus Thorne saw her stance. He saw the subtle shift in her weight, the way her feet were perfectly balanced, a posture of readiness he hadn't seen since his own days in special operations. He saw the way her fingers, though still, held a latent energy, a coiled potential that had nothing to do with janitorial duties. The captain leaned forward, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. A forgotten memory, a whisper from a classified briefing 2 decades ago, began to surface. He saw not an old woman in coveralls, but a silhouette against the harsh light of a computer screen, a figure spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. If you believe that true strength is found not in the volume of the voice, but in the precision of the action, type competence below. The woman in gray finally moved, but not in the way the cadets expected. There was no outrage, no tears, no hurried retreat. Her movements were economical, stripped of any wasted energy. She reached into a pocket of her coveralls and produced a small, immaculately clean white cloth. With a slow, deliberate motion, she wiped the spittle from her sleeve, her eyes never once lifting to meet the gaze of her tormentor. She folded the cloth neatly, returned it to her pocket, and then, as if the entire incident had been a minor, irrelevant distraction, her fingers returned to the diagnostic console. The keys clicked softly, a rhythmic, steady sound in the vast, silent room. The cadets, led by Price, took this silence as weakness, as confirmation of her irrelevance. They saw a defeated menial, an insignificant cog who knew her place. Price smirked, turning to his audience of sycophants, and was about to deliver another witty barb when the main lights of the simulator suddenly bathed the room in a blood-red emergency glow. The serene ocean vista on the 360-degree holographic display vanished, replaced by a chaotic tactical map blinking with dozens of hostile contacts. A synthesized voice, cold and devoid of emotion, echoed through the chamber, alert. Red Omega scenario initiated. All systems compromised. Command integrity failure imminent. Survival probability. 0-inch. A wave of panic washed over the cadets. The Red Omega was a legend, a mythical Kobayashi Maru scenario whispered about in the barracks. It wasn't a test. It was an execution, a simulation designed by the Navy's most brilliant minds to be utterly, hopelessly unwinnable. It was a ghost story used to frighten plebes, not a live-fire drill for the Academy's elite. Jackson Price, for all his bluster, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. This was his command rotation. This failure would be his. He stared at the tactical display, his mind, so quick with insults moments before, now a complete and utter blank. The hostile icons were swarming his carrier group from all sides, their weapons' signatures already locked. His communications were a waterfall of static. His defense systems were offline, flagged with angry red error messages. It was a digital slaughterhouse, and he was the lamb. He barked orders, his voice cracking with a frantic edge that betrayed his polished facade. Reboot the CIWS. Give me a satellite link now. Evasive maneuvers, full spread. His commands were met with silence and system failure alarms. His bridge crew, the best and brightest of their year, were frozen, their faces pale masks of shock and disbelief. They were pilots without planes, captains without rudders. The simulation was designed to overwhelm, to break the very concept of command, and it was succeeding spectacularly. The room, once a stage for Price's petty cruelty, had become his personal hell, every flashing red light a testament to his inadequacy. His arrogance, so robust in the face of a single, unarmed woman, shattered into a million pieces against the unyielding logic of the simulation. He was failing publicly and catastrophically. The silence that followed his last, desperate order was heavier and more damning than any laughter. It was the sound of absolute defeat. In that void, another sound emerged, the soft, steady, and utterly calm clicking of keys from the secondary console in the corner. The rhythmic tapping was an anchor in the swirling chaos, a single point of order in a universe of entropy. Every head in the room, including Captain Thorne's in the observation deck, turned towards the source. The woman in the gray coveralls was still at her station, her posture unchanged. She hadn't even looked up at the main holographic display. Her attention was entirely consumed by the streams of amber code flowing down her small screen. She seemed to be in a different world, oblivious to the simulated Armageddon unfolding around her. Jackson Price, his authority evaporating with every passing second, felt a surge of irrational fury. "What are you doing?" he yelled, his voice shrill. "This is a command-level simulation. Get away from that console. You're contaminating the data." His words were meaningless, the desperate lashing out of a drowning man. The woman ignored him completely. Her right hand darted out, not to the sleek touch sensitive controls the cadets used, but to a small, unassuming panel near the floor, covered in a thin layer of dust. With a precise motion, she unlatched it, revealing a set of older, physical toggle switches and a port for a hardline connection, relics from a previous system build that were supposed to have been decommissioned. She pulled a coiled cable from another pocket and jacked it directly into the port, bypassing the main user interface entirely. She was going into the machine's guts. "Security, get her out of here!" Price screamed, his composure completely gone. But before any of the stunned cadets could react, a voice, amplified and dripping with glacial authority, boomed from the overhead speakers. It was Captain Thorne. "Mr. Price, you will stand down. You will remain silent. And you will watch." The command was absolute, a steel blade that cut through Price's hysteria and froze him in place. A new kind of silence fell over the room, one of deep apprehension and profound confusion. The cadets watched, their training and doctrine giving them no framework for what they were witnessing. The woman was not engaging in tactics. She was not attempting to fight the enemy fleet. She was performing something else, something more fundamental. Her fingers danced across her keyboard in a blur of motion, typing lines of code with a speed and fluency that was mesmerizing. It was a language they didn't understand, a conversation with the soul of the machine. On her small screen, she wasn't looking at tactical data. She was navigating the system's core architecture. She was a surgeon, and the simulation's corrupted operating system was her patient. She began to manually reroute power from non-essential life support systems, shunting gigawatts of virtual energy into the overwhelmed sensor arrays. She didn't just reboot the communication suite. She purged its entire memory cache and forced a cold restart from the system's base code, using a back-end protocol so old it wasn't even in the training manuals. She found a malicious code that was crippling their defenses, a ghost injected by the simulation's architect, and she didn't delete it. She isolated it, quarantined it, and then began to rewrite it, turning the virus into a weapon. The cadets could not comprehend what she was doing, but they could see the effects. On the main holographic display, the angry red error messages began to blink out one by one. The wall of static on the comms channel resolved into a crystal-clear tactical data link. The CIWS defense grids flickered from red to amber and then to a solid, reassuring green. The impossible was happening. She was healing the ship. She was resurrecting a dead command center with nothing but a keyboard and an archaic understanding of the digital world. The process was methodical, relentless, and utterly silent, save for the whisper of the keys. It was a demonstration of a power so far beyond their comprehension that it felt like magic. They weren't just watching a technician. They were watching a master at work, her calm precision a stark, humiliating contrast to Price's loud, ineffective panic. The sheer competence on display was an indictment of everything they thought they knew about strength and authority. The final piece of her work was an act of breathtaking elegance. The hostile code she had rewritten was now a Trojan horse. With a final decisive keystroke, she sent it back out into the simulation's network. On the main display, the swarming icons of the enemy fleet began to flicker. Their weapons' signatures vanished. Their targeting locks disengaged. She hadn't fired a single missile or torpedo. She had blinded them, severed their ability to communicate with each other, and turned their own network against them. She had achieved a total information warfare victory without a single shot. A single, perfect firing solution appeared on the tactical map. A clean, surgical strike that would eliminate the enemy command ship and send the now deaf and blind fleet into disarray. The simulation, recognizing this new, impossible variable, froze. The red emergency lighting gave way to a neutral white. In the center of the holographic display, a single line of text glowed in vibrant green. Scenario override. Success. Survival probability. 100%. For a long moment, the only sound was the gentle hum of the environmental controls. The cadets stood like statues, their mouths slightly agape. Jackson Price stared at the green text, his mind refusing to process the information. It was not possible. The red omega was, by its very definition, impossible. He had seen the code. He had studied the parameters. It was a test of character in the face of certain defeat. No one was supposed to win. Yet, the evidence was right there, glowing in front of him, a silent, irrefutable testament to the miracle he had just witnessed. The woman in gray disconnected her cable, coiled it neatly, and placed it back in her pocket. She closed the dusty maintenance panel and, with the same unhurried calm she had exhibited all along, returned to her original task at the secondary diagnostic console, as if she had just finished a routine bit of maintenance and not single-handedly defied the fundamental laws of their simulated universe. Her complete lack of triumph, her absence of any "I told you so" glance, was somehow the most devastating blow of all. It relegated her impossible achievement to the realm of the mundane, implying a level of skill so vast that this was simply what she did. It was just another day at the office. The spell of stunned silence was broken by the sound of the main door to the simulator hissing open. Captain Marcus Thorne stepped into the room, his face an unreadable mask of granite. He didn't look at the tactical display. He didn't look at the dumbfounded cadets. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, were fixed on one person only, the woman in the gray coveralls. He walked across the polished floor, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. He moved with a purpose that commanded attention, each step deliberate and heavy with significance. The cadets instinctively stiffened, their posture shifting to a parade ground rigidity. Jackson Price felt a fresh wave of cold dread, this time laced with a dawning, terrifying suspicion. The captain's gaze was not one of an officer addressing a civilian contractor or maintenance worker. It was a look of profound, almost reverent respect. Thorne came to a stop directly in front of the woman, who finally looked up from her console. For the first time, the cadets could see her eyes clearly. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they held a depth of experience that made the entire room feel young and foolish. The two of them, the decorated captain and the woman in the janitor's uniform, shared a look of mutual understanding that transcended rank and appearance. It was a look between two old wolves, two professionals who recognized the same steel in each other's soul. Captain Thorne held her gaze for a moment longer before turning to face the assembled cadets. His voice, when he spoke, was low and dangerous, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the force of a hammer blow. For the past 3 years, he began, his eyes sweeping over the young, frightened faces, You have been taught the principles of naval warfare. You have studied tactics, strategy, and logistics. You have been told that you are the elite, the future leaders of the fleet, the inheritors of a proud and storied tradition. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Today, you have been given a lesson in a subject that is not on any curriculum. A lesson in humility. A lesson in the vastness of your own ignorance. He turned his head slightly, gesturing towards the main display. You were put into the Red Omega scenario. This simulation was not designed as a test of tactics. It was designed as a test of the Prometheus combat operating system itself, a system that will one day run every ship in our fleet. The Red Omega was created by the Prometheus project's lead architect to find the system's absolute breaking point. It is by design unwinnable. No command team, no admiral, no supercomputer has ever survived it, let alone defeated it. He let that fact sink in, a palpable weight of impossibility. No one, he repeated, his voice dropping even lower, until today. Because no one, until today, has been foolish enough to run the test while its creator was in the room performing a systems diagnostic. A collective, silent gasp seemed to pass through the cadets. Minds struggled to connect the dots, to reconcile the image of the quiet woman in coveralls with the legendary, almost mythical figure of the Prometheus project's architect. Jackson Price felt the blood drain from his face. It couldn't be. It was a ghost story, a name whispered in the highest echelons of the Pentagon. Captain Thorne took a deep breath, his back ramrod straight. He then performed an action that shattered the last vestiges of the cadet's reality. He pivoted on his heel to face the woman, clicked his heels together with a sound like a rifle shot, and snapped to the most rigid, perfect position of attention Jackson Price had ever witnessed. His hand came up in a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. His voice, stripped of all artifice, boomed with a raw, powerful reverence that shook the very foundations of the room. Admiral Evelyn Hayes, he declared, his voice thick with emotion. On behalf of the United States Naval War College, I offer my sincerest apologies for the conditions of your inspection. Ma'am, the name hung in the air, heavy as an anchor. Admiral Hayes, the ghost of the Pacific, the reclusive genius who had single-handedly redesigned naval information warfare after the South China Sea incident. The architect of the very digital world they inhabited. The living legend they had mistaken for a janitor. Thorne held his salute, his arm locked, his eyes fixed forward, a subordinate paying tribute to a superior officer of immense stature. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum of pure, unadulterated shock. The cadets stood frozen, their arrogance and cruelty exposed as the pathetic posturing of children. The world had just been turned upside down, and they were left staring at the wreckage of their own assumptions, their own prejudice. The quiet woman, Admiral Evelyn Hayes, simply gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the acknowledgement that was needed. She had proven her point not with words, but with a silent, irrefutable demonstration of competence. The salute was the breaking point. It was a formal, institutional recognition of a reality so far removed from the cadets' perception that it shattered their worldview like a pane of glass. The sight of their commanding officer, a man they respected and feared, standing at rigid attention before the woman they had mocked, was a lesson more profound than any lecture. Captain Thorne finally lowered his arm, but he remained at attention. He then turned his head, his gaze falling upon Jackson Price with the weight of a physical blow. The ice in his eyes could have frozen the sun. "Cadet Lieutenant Commander Price," he said, his voice now dangerously soft. "You stand here today as a representative of everything wrong with a modern officer corps. You confused arrogance with confidence. You mistook a uniform for a measure of worth. You saw a woman of advanced years and simple work clothes in your mind, so narrow and so thoroughly steeped in prejudice, could only process one conclusion. That she was beneath you, each word was a precise, surgical cut. You did not just disrespect a civilian contractor. You did not just insult an old woman. You stood on the bridge of a simulated warship, a place you were supposed to be worthy of commanding, and you spat on a 5-star admiral. You spat on the woman who designed the very ground you stand on. You spat on a living piece of naval history. A hero whose name you are not worthy to speak. Price stood ramrod straight, his face ashen. He looked as if he had been physically struck. He tried to speak, to form an apology, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was a knot of shame. You and your snickering sycophants. Thorne continued, his gaze sweeping across the other cadets, who now refused to meet his eyes, have brought disgrace upon this uniform, this academy, and yourselves. You will report to my office at 0600 tomorrow morning to be formally charged. You will be stripped of your leadership positions, and you will spend the remainder of your time here learning the true meaning of service, starting with scrubbing the latrines for the entire enlisted barracks. Perhaps there, you will learn that the person cleaning the floors has more honor and integrity than you have collectively shown today. Thorne turned back to Admiral Hayes, his demeanor softening instantly. Admiral, my deepest apologies again. Your quarters are prepared. I will escort you personally. Admiral Hayes finally looked away from her console. She gave a small, dismissive wave of her hand. Not necessary, Captain, she said, her voice quiet but clear, the first full sentence she had spoken. The diagnostic is almost complete. Competence is the only currency that matters. Let's see if the boy has any. It was not an absolution, but a challenge. A chance, however slim, for redemption. The quiet authority in her voice was more powerful than any of Thorne's thunderous rebukes. She had dismantled a fleet, dismantled an arrogant cadet, and dismantled an entire system of prejudice without ever raising her voice. Her silence had been a crucible, burning away their assumptions until only the hard, undeniable truth remained. The story of what happened in Simulator 7 did not stay within its walls. It erupted, spreading through the Naval War College with the speed and intensity of a wildfire. It was first whispered in hushed tones in the mess hall, then debated in the barracks late at night, and finally, it became a full-blown legend, retold with increasing embellishment by everyone from the lowest plebe to the senior faculty. The name Admiral Hayes became an immediate fixture in the Academy's lexicon. To pull a Hayes meant to solve a complex problem with quiet, unassuming genius. The dusty maintenance panel she had used became an object of reverence, soon protected by a small, polished brass plaque that read, "The Hayes Protocol Simulator 7 was unofficially renamed the Admiral's Chair, a place where the institution's biggest egos have been brought to heel." The legend served as a powerful corrective, a cautionary tale that rippled through the culture of the entire campus. Cadets began to look at the civilian staff differently, with a newfound respect and a nagging uncertainty. Was the quiet librarian who stamped their books a former intelligence analyst? Was the groundskeeper who tended the roses a retired Master Chief? The incident injected a healthy dose of humility into a place that was often suffocating in its own self-importance. For Jackson Price, the aftermath was a journey into a personal wilderness. He was not expelled, a fact he later learned was due to a quiet word from Admiral Hayes herself, who had argued the ruined career taught no lessons. Instead, his punishment was to be rebuilt. He was stripped of his rank and privileges, taken from the top of the class, and placed at the very bottom. His days were filled with the kind of menial, thankless labor he had once believed was beneath him. He scrubbed floors, cleaned grease traps in the galley, and polished brass until his hands were raw. His former friends, the ones who had laughed at his cruel joke, now avoided him, their own shame making them unable to face him. He was isolated, humbled, and forced to confront the ugly truth of who he had become. During those long weeks of grueling work and social ostracism, he did nothing but think. He replayed the incident in Simulator 7 over and over in his mind. He saw the Admiral's calm face, her steady hands, her complete and utter lack of reaction to his vile insult. He saw her methodical brilliance as she dismantled the unwinnable scenario. He saw Captain Thorne salute, a gesture of respect so profound it had physically rocked him. He finally understood that he had built his entire identity on a foundation of sand. His confidence had been nothing more than arrogance propped up by lineage and a system that rewarded superficiality. He had worshipped the uniform, but had no understanding of the person within it. He had confused the symbols of power with power itself. True power, he realized, was quiet. It was the silent competence of Admiral Hayes, the the calm authority of Captain Thorne. It was something you earned in the darkness when no one was watching, not something you proclaimed from a stage. One evening, after weeks of deliberation, he formally requested permission to speak with Admiral Hayes, who had extended her stay to oversee the Prometheus integration. He was granted a 5-minute interview. He entered her temporary office, a Spartan room filled with technical manuals and schematics. The Admiral was at her desk, engrossed in a complex wiring diagram. She didn't look up immediately. Price stood at attention, his heart pounding. He had rehearsed a long, eloquent apology, but in her presence, the words felt hollow and insufficient. When she finally raised her pale blue eyes to meet his, he simply said, "Ma'am, I was wrong. There is no excuse for my actions. I am sorry." His voice was quiet, stripped of all its former bluster. It was the first honest thing he had felt he'd said in years. Admiral Hayes studied him for a long moment, her gaze analytical, as if she were running a diagnostic on his character. "The first step in fixing a flawed system, Mr. Price," she said, her voice even and devoid of judgment, "is acknowledging that the flaw exists. Your service record shows you have the potential for exceptional competence. Do not allow your assumptions to devalue that potential ever again. That will be all." She looked back down at her work. Dismissed. He was not forgiven. He was not punished further. He was assessed, given a piece of critical data, and sent on his way. The brief, technical exchange was more transformative than any disciplinary hearing could have been. It was a lesson from a master, delivered with the same precision she used to rewrite code. Jackson Price walked out of that office a different man. The weight of his arrogance was gone, replaced by the lighter, stronger burden of humility. His journey back would be long, but for the first time, he was walking in the right direction. The legacy of Admiral Hayes's visit endured long after she departed. The story became institutionalized, a core part of the orientation for every new class of cadets entering the Naval War College. It was told by Captain Thorne himself, who would stand before the new arrivals in Simulator 7 and recount the events of that fateful day. He would point to the brass plaque to the secondary console, and he would tell them about a quiet woman in gray coveralls who had taught them all a lesson about the nature of respect. The story served as a powerful inoculation against the kind of unearned arrogance that had defined Jackson Price's early career. It became a foundational myth for a new generation of officers, a reminder that the most formidable weapon in any arsenal is a quiet, disciplined mind. It taught them to look past the surface, to seek competence in the most unlikely of places, and to understand that a person's worth is defined by their actions, not their appearance or the rank on their collar. A year later, a much-changed Jackson Price stood on that same simulator bridge, this time as a junior instructor. He was quieter now, more thoughtful. His confidence was no longer brittle. It was forged in the fires of his own humiliation and tempered by genuine self-awareness. He was mentoring a young, nervous ensign who was struggling with a complex tactical problem. The ensign was flustered, overwhelmed by the data, and his voice was rising in panic. The old Price would have berated him, torn him down to build himself up. The new Price placed a steadying hand on the young man's shoulder. "Breathe, ensign," he said, his voice calm and low. "Forget the noise. Forget the pressure. Just look at the system. Find a flaw. The answer is right there in the code. You just have to be quiet enough to see it in that moment." The lesson had come full circle. The legacy of Admiral Hayes was not in the plaque on the wall or the legend told to plebes. It was here, in the quiet transfer of wisdom, in the transformation of a flawed cadet into a true leader. It was in the understanding that true strength doesn't need to announce itself. It simply is. The quietest professionals are often the ones who carry the greatest weight of responsibility and the sharpest edge of skill. They do not seek validation through words, for their work is their only necessary statement. A uniform defines a function, a role to be played within a larger machine, but it is the character of the individual within that uniform that defines the warrior. Legacy is not a monument carved from stone, left behind to be admired. It is a lesson, a principle, a way of being that is passed down, hand to hand, mind to mind, continuing forward long after the originator is gone. It is the quiet competence that echoes in the actions of those who learn to listen. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud ignorance, and where professional silence defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.